In the early years of the Pacific War, the Imperial Japanese Army believed it had found the ultimate defensive formula. After their sweeping conquests across Asia and the Pacific in 1941 and 1942, their engineers began carving fortresses into the very bones of the islands they occupied. They dug deep, building labyrinths of bunkers, tunnels, and hidden pillboxes. To them, this wasn't just construction. It was a shield, a place to die but never surrender. The terrain was their accomplice. Volcanic rock, coral ridges, and dense jungle wrapped around their designs like armor. A single pillbox carved into a cliffside could hold off dozens of attackers. Some bunkers were so deep inside the earth that only the heaviest naval guns could shake them loose. They weren't just hiding places. They were meant to be execution chambers for anyone who dared approach. Japanese doctrine demanded absolute resistance. Soldiers were trained to see their bunkers not only as protection but as tombs. Surrender was shame. Death was duty. Their commanders taught them that their fortifications would outlast artillery, bombs, and time itself. And so they dug in, waiting for the inevitable American counterattack, convinced they could bleed the enemy dry of morale and men. Their firepower was carefully positioned. Machine guns were set to create interlocking fields of fire. Mortars were dug into pits behind the lines. Camouflage was so clever that bunkers often disappeared into the landscape until they opened fire. And when they did, they turned beaches and jungle trails into killing zones. It wasn't about fighting for a day. It was about holding until death. On Tarawa, on Guadalcanal in New Guinea, they believed they had crafted fortresses that could last for months, no matter how overwhelming the American material advantage might be. They saw themselves as an immovable wall, but they had underestimated their enemy. The Americans arrived expecting brutal resistance, but what they encountered was something more. After days of artillery bombardment, when they advanced, the Japanese were still there. Machine guns roared from hidden slits. Snipers picked off men crawling through mud. Mortar shells landed with sickening precision. Every inch of ground was paid for in blood. American commanders quickly realized that conventional assaults weren't enough. Shelling the bunkers only delayed the inevitable. The defenders would emerge again the moment the dust settled. Rifle fire and grenades barely scratched the surface. These positions were built to be endured, not destroyed. To take them head-on was to feed men into a machine designed to kill them. Inside these bunkers, Japanese soldiers had accepted their fate. They were prepared to starve rather than surrender. They were cut off with no hope of evacuation, but their doctrine didn't allow retreat. Their faith in the strength of their defenses was almost religious. To them, these caves and tunnels were unbreakable. Their walls gave them courage. Their isolation gave them purpose. But what they couldn't foresee was how American innovation would turn that confidence into a weakness. They expected bombardment. They expected bullets. They expected the sky to rain steel. But they never expected what would come next: fire. In the months ahead, American forces would begin to adapt their assaults around the bunkers themselves. They would stop treating them as unmovable obstacles and start turning them into traps. The Japanese soldiers who believed their defenses would guarantee them a glorious last stand would learn that those same tunnels and caves could become ovens. It began slowly. American flamethrower units were still in their infancy. The Japanese had seen such weapons before in China, but they didn't believe they would define the war in the Pacific. Their calculations focused on surviving rifles, machine guns, and artillery barrages. They didn't imagine entire specialized teams armed with fire. Their faith in the earth beneath them would prove fatal. As American tactics evolved, the same bunkers built to ensure endurance would become death traps. Their fortresses would not hold forever. In fact, they would burn from the inside out. And so, on those remote islands of black sand and coral, as jungle winds whispered through hidden openings and soldiers whispered last prayers, a storm was forming, not of shells, not of steel, but of fire that would change everything. In the early months of the Pacific Campaign, the Japanese saw themselves as unbreakable. Their bunkers were carved into the earth like scars, their defenses crafted not just to stop the enemy but to bleed him. But the Americans were learning, and by the time the flames reached the islands, it was too late to adapt. At Guadalcanal, the jungle swallowed everything. The air was thick, the ground wet, and the enemy hidden. Japanese machine guns waited in silence behind camouflaged slits, their interlocking fields of fire ready to tear advancing Marines apart. Grenades, mortars, and rifle fire were answered by bunkers that seemed to come alive after every bombardment. Shells fell, smoke cleared, and the defenders rose again from the earth like ghosts. American troops had trained for a different war, one fought across open fields in Europe, where an overwhelmed enemy would retreat or surrender. But here the enemy didn't move. He waited. He endured. Bunkers soaked up artillery like sponges and returned fire as if nothing had happened. Marines were forced to crawl through thick vegetation, grenades in their hands, knowing that the next few feet might mean a burst of machine gun fire they couldn't escape. At the Matanico River, Japanese pillboxes controlled the ridges. Assaults uphill turned into slaughter. Positions believed destroyed reawakened hours later as survivors inside remanned their guns. These fortifications weren't just walls, they were traps. Every Japanese soldier inside had accepted that he was already dead, and for the Americans trying to take those hills, it felt like fighting an army of men who didn't care if they died. Conventional tactics failed, artillery couldn't crack them open, rifle fire did nothing. Airstrikes barely scratched the surface. The jungle made spotting targets almost impossible. The bunkers were dug deep, shielded by coral, timber, and earth. Marines resorted to desperate improvisation. They rolled fuel drums toward enemy positions, lit them with tracer fire, or packed satchel charges to suffocate defenders inside. It was brutal, primitive, and slow. Every bunker became its own siege. For the Japanese, this was proof their doctrine worked. Diaries recovered later told the story with pride. They wrote of withstanding American bombardment, of holding their lines despite overwhelming firepower. To them, every hour they delayed the enemy was victory. Their faith in their underground fortresses hardened. But those same battles were teaching the Americans something different. Guadalcanal became their laboratory. They learned that fire, not steel, would break these positions. Even before the flamethrowers arrived in numbers, the Marines understood that suffocating the defenders was more effective than blasting them. The Japanese hadn't counted on facing an enemy that learned this fast. The turning point wasn't a single battle. It was the accumulation of frustration, blood, and stubborn resistance. Commanders began demanding new tools. They asked the Chemical Warfare Service to accelerate the production of portable flamethrowers. They needed a way to reach into those holes in the earth and end the fight in seconds, not hours. The defenders were still convinced their bunkers were eternal. The Americans were preparing to prove them wrong. Fire was coming, and Guadalcanal was only the beginning. In 1942, the Japanese defenders on their island fortresses were certain they understood the shape of war. Rifles, mortars, artillery, bombs, these were the tools they expected their enemy to bring. What they never imagined was a weapon that would slither into the very mouths of their bunkers, consume their air, and turn their last sanctuary into a furnace. That weapon didn't arrive fully formed. It was born out of frustration. On Guadalcanal and New Guinea, American units had struggled to dig out defenders who refused to die. Heavy artillery hadn't worked. Grenades and rifle fire barely made a dent. Even when a position was bombed flat, the Japanese emerged from their tunnels as if the earth itself was fighting alongside them. Somewhere in those dark months, a simple truth settled into the minds of U.S. commanders. If the Japanese were going to hide in the ground, then the Americans would burn the ground itself. By late 1942, the U.S. Army's Chemical Warfare Service dusted off old ideas about incendiary weapons. They refined a portable weapon, capable of projecting a stream of burning fuel up to 45 yards. The M1 flamethrower was clumsy, dangerous, and terrifying. Its successor, the M1A1, would become infamous. At first, these weapons were seen as tools for specialists, a niche solution for stubborn positions. But in the Pacific, where stubborn positions were everywhere, that niche became the center of the war. A flamethrower operator carried nearly 70 pounds of volatile fuel strapped to his back. He was the most exposed man on the battlefield, a walking target. Every Japanese defender who saw him through a slit sight knew what he was. And yet these men volunteered, trained, and advanced under fire. They didn't just bring flame, they brought fear. The weapon wasn't used in isolation. American units built teams around the operator. Riflemen and machine gunners formed a moving wall of protection, cutting down any Japanese soldier who tried to shoot or charge. The operator would creep forward, often on his stomach, find the mouth of a bunker, and send a jet of fire inside. Within seconds, oxygen was gone, heat filled the chamber, and the screams told the rest. Napalm changed everything. Mixed into the fuel, it clung to surfaces, burned hotter, burned longer. Timber, bamboo, palm logs, the same materials that once strengthened the bunkers now became kindling. The Japanese had dug themselves deep to survive steel. They had dug themselves into perfect traps for fire. By mid-1943, flamethrowers were no longer experimental. They were doctrine. They were part of every major assault unit in the Pacific. Marines who once tried to storm bunkers head-on now advanced with cold precision. A burst of flame, a satchel charge, a collapsed position, minutes instead of hours. For the defenders, it was unlike anything they had prepared for. Japanese soldiers had trained to outlast artillery. They believed they could withstand bombs and bullets. But fire crept into places none of those could reach. It stole air from their lungs. It made their courage irrelevant. A Japanese survivor captured in 1943 whispered to his interrogators, "The fire comes into the ground. It finds us where we hide. It finds everything." The Americans had found their answer. Saipan was supposed to be unbreakable. Months before the first Marines came ashore, Japanese engineers carved bunkers into the island's ridges like veins beneath the skin. Machine guns, mortars, artillery, all hidden inside pillboxes and caves. They believed the rugged interior and reinforced fortifications would slow any invasion to a crawl. The defenders waited with a sense of grim certainty. They had trained their entire lives for this kind of stand. When the Americans landed in June 1944, they didn't attack blindly. By then, the lessons of Guadalcanal had hardened into doctrine. Every assault squad carried not just rifles, but fire. Flamethrower operators advanced behind riflemen, shielded from snipers and machine gun fire. Demolition teams trailed behind, ready to collapse whatever remained. What had once been a drawn-out battle was now a carefully choreographed sequence: suppress, burn, demolish, move on. The Japanese inside their bunkers felt the change instantly. A burst of fire roared through the firing slit, filling the cramped space in seconds. The heat clung to everything. The oxygen vanished. Men who had sworn to fight to the death found their lungs burning before they could raise their rifles. Those who stumbled out fled into a waiting wall of gunfire. Reports from the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions recorded bunker complexes being cleared in under an hour, positions Japanese officers had sworn could hold for weeks. One flamethrower operator described the process coldly. It was like turning off a light. 1 second they're firing, the next, silence. On Tinian weeks later, the same pattern repeated. Japanese soldiers waited in their cliffside caves, convinced their fortifications were impenetrable. The Marines brought fire. Flamethrower bursts, followed by satchel charges, reduced entire strongpoints to blackened holes in the rock. Defenders who had spent months digging their fortresses were wiped out in minutes. The psychological effect spread faster than the flames. Japanese soldiers began abandoning positions after seeing neighboring bunkers consumed. Some tried to charge flamethrower operators in suicidal bursts. Others ran. The Bushido Code had prepared them to die, but it had not prepared them to burn. A Japanese lieutenant wrote before his death, "We built these caves to protect us. Now they are the place where we die. Fire comes like water through cracks. It cannot be stopped." American commanders recognized this fear and leaned into it. Flamethrowers weren't just tools to destroy fortifications. They were weapons to break morale. The sight of a man advancing with fuel tanks on his back and a nozzle in his hands became enough to empty positions before the trigger was ever pulled. Saipan and Tinian marked the moment when Japanese bunker warfare began to crumble. What had once been their shield became their trap. The Americans had found the key, and the fire spread from island to island like a storm that couldn't be stopped. Iwo Jima was never meant to fall quickly. Japanese commanders had spent months carving the island into a fortress. Beneath the black volcanic rock stretched a maze of tunnels, pillboxes, and concealed firing positions. Over 11 miles of interconnected defenses covered every ridge and every approach. General Kurabayashi's strategy was simple: make every yard of ground a killing zone, bleed the Americans until the island itself turned red. When the bombardment came, it was like the sky collapsing. Naval guns thundered for days. Carrier planes dropped endless bombs. The island shook, but when the Marines came ashore on February 19, 1945, the Japanese guns opened up as if nothing had happened. The bunkers had survived. The Marines were walking straight into a trap. But this time the Americans carried fire. Portable flamethrowers were everywhere, and behind them came Sherman tanks fitted with flame projectors, nicknamed Ronsons and Zippos. These weren't slow-burning jets. These were streams of napalm, thick, sticky fire that could reach out more than 100 feet. It wasn't just a weapon anymore, it was a tide. Flamethrower tanks rolled forward, aiming their nozzles into cave mouths. A single burst could light the interior like a furnace. Portable operators crawled under fire, slipping flames into cracks and gun slits. In reports from the 5th Marine Division, dozens of defensive sites credited as impregnable were erased in minutes. The volcanic rock made it worse. The fuel seeped through fissures in the ground, igniting hidden chambers. Defenders who thought they were safe deep underground suddenly felt fire licking through the darkness. Screams echoed through sealed tunnels, their air consumed before they could fight back. The Japanese tried everything. Snipers hunted flamethrower operators. Suicide squads charged flame tanks with explosives. They fought with ferocity, but the fire kept coming. A single operator could silence a bunker that had withstood artillery for weeks. One Marine flamethrower operator, Herschel "Woody" Williams, advanced alone through heavy fire, taking out multiple pillboxes in a single day. Acts like his became legends, but they also underscored a brutal truth. The battle wasn't decided by brute force anymore. It was decided by whoever controlled the fire. For the Japanese soldiers trapped underground, there was no escape. The tunnels they had built as protection became graves. When flames didn't kill them, collapsing ceilings and choking smoke did. The island's defenders were burned out, entombed, or suffocated where they stood. And then came Okinawa. Unlike Iwo Jima, it was vast, hills, ridges, a civilian population, and nearly 100,000 defenders. The Japanese prepared even deeper and stronger positions, but the Americans no longer fought the old way. Flamethrowers weren't just carried by squads now. They were integrated into the entire battle plan. Sherman flame tanks fired jets of napalm across 150 yards. Engineers followed with satchel charges. Infantry advanced behind the fire like a tide rolling forward. Japanese soldiers who once waited calmly in caves during artillery barrages now panicked when they saw the fuel tanks. Some fled before the flame arrived. Others stayed and died in silence. Even limestone caves that had been thought impregnable became ovens once the napalm filled their interiors. Reports from the 6th Marine Division described cave complexes cleared in minutes. Hundreds of positions that once would have cost days of fighting were gone in a single afternoon. Commanders noted the effect, not just destruction, but despair. The fire had broken the defenders before the rifles ever reached them. For many of the Japanese soldiers on Okinawa, it wasn't about victory anymore. It was about choosing how they would die. Fire left no room for honor, no room for ritual, no chance to fight back. It was a death that felt inescapable. Iwo Jima and Okinawa marked the complete collapse of Japan's fortress doctrine. They had built their defenses to endure steel, but steel could be endured, fire could not. By 1945, the Japanese soldier no longer feared artillery. He no longer feared bullets. He feared the sound of a pressurized hiss in the distance. He feared the shape of a man advancing through smoke with a tank on his back and a nozzle in his hands. He feared fire. The Imperial Japanese Army had built its doctrine on endurance. Its soldiers had been raised on the Bushido Code, an unyielding belief that it was honorable to die in place. They could endure hunger. They could endure being surrounded. They could endure bombardment. But flamethrowers didn't test endurance. They erased it. Unlike shells or bullets, fire crept into every corner of a defensive position. It flooded caves, filled bunkers, and devoured the oxygen defenders needed to breathe. It didn't leave space for courage or time for ritual. It didn't care about code. A soldier could shout "Banzai" into the dark, but his voice would disappear in a roar of flame. Interrogations of captured Japanese soldiers revealed how deep this terror ran. They called it the devil's weapon. Many admitted they no longer believed their bunkers could save them. The walls that once gave them confidence had turned into coffins. Some soldiers who had sworn to die fighting fled at the sight of a flamethrower operator. Others launched suicidal counterattacks not out of hope of victory, but to escape being burned alive. The Americans recognized this fear and used it. By the final year of the war, manuals didn't just recommend flamethrowers as a tactical weapon, they described them as a psychological one. A single burst could shatter the morale of nearby defenders, forcing them to abandon their positions before the first shot was fired. Snipers were assigned to kill flamethrower operators. Suicide squads were sent to destroy flame tanks, but these measures were desperate. The operators were protected by teams. The tanks were armored. Each failed attack deepened the hopelessness inside the caves. Japanese soldiers had been trained to fear dishonor more than death, but now they feared the flame more than both. The Bushido Code had reached its limit. It was a belief forged in an age of swords and rifles, but the war had changed. The Americans weren't just bringing overwhelming firepower. They were bringing a weapon that reached into the very places Japanese soldiers thought were untouchable. No spiritual code could stop suffocation. No warrior's courage could push back the heat. After the war, captured diaries revealed the shift. "The flame is different," one Japanese soldier wrote. It takes the air, it takes everything. American commanders knew it too. Artillery destroyed structures, fire destroyed will, and in war, that was the difference between resistance and collapse. Even those who survived the infernos carried the scars in their minds. Some wrote of the sudden silence after flame entered a cave, how entire units vanished without a sound. Others described their comrades clawing at the walls as the heat closed in. This wasn't a clean death, it was total. The psychological shock didn't just end with surrender. It echoed into post-war reflection. Japanese officers admitted their faith in underground defenses had been misplaced. What they had believed were fortresses were in truth tombs waiting to be sealed. For the Americans, the flamethrower became both a symbol of tactical efficiency and moral unease. Soldiers who used it spoke of the effectiveness, but many also spoke of the screams. Flamethrowers changed the way armies thought about fortifications. The caves of Saipan, the ridges of Okinawa, the black sand of Iwo Jima, all had proven the same lesson. No fortress is eternal when the enemy carries fire in his hands. The Pacific War ended with cities in flames and armies burned out of the ground. But long after the last bunker was silent, the fire remained in the memory of those who faced it. To the Americans, it was a weapon. To the Japanese who lived through it, it was something worse. It was the sound of the end.